level understanding of Chinese work values. Unfortunately, Professor Ralston cannot be here today, but fortunately, Professor Egri is. And so I think some of you do know her. Dr. Egri is a William Rowe EMBA alumni professor at the Beatty School of Business, Simon Fraser University. She's an active researcher and contributor to her profession, both internal and external to the university. She has also researched extensively on corporate social responsibility and sustainability around the world. Dr. Egri's presentation will be followed by question and answer, so further to turn the podium to Carolyn.
Okay, thank you, Rosalie. Yes, this is, for those of you who are here on November presentation, this is from, what I'm going to present today is from a whole different program of research that David and I are involved with. So I'll be presenting both, there are two parts to this, and I'll be able to present on both of them because they're related in a number of different ways, but they make significantly different points and contributions about our understandings about what exactly is values, personal values orientation in China, and how are they changing and how are they different within China. Because what's bringing us together here is often there's a stereotype about one country, one set of values. And what we're challenging in our research, what I'll be presenting today, is say it's a little bit more complicated than that, as you know. So, but we have very little research that's actually looking within. So looking within at a regional level, which is part one of my presentation. And then part two will be looking not at regional, but subcultures that are associated with generation cohorts. And there's been a lot of interest in particular about Chinese millennials, and I'll be addressing that in our the second half. So there's two pieces, they're related. Some of the data is in common, but not all of it. So how can we understand more about what's going on around values and values change? And if you have any questions, please ask, okay? Because I want to make sure that I can address any concerns or questions you may have. So, part one, longitudinal study of regional differences in China. Where this started actually was a paper that I was not part of because I hadn't started collaborating with David. Is 1996 was published. And in that paper, David and colleagues published about identifying regions, 6 regions of China. It was a cross-sectional survey, and they identified that there were differences between the regions, whether it was in the Middle West, the coastal East, and then the Northeast. So that was the focus of that study, and it was based on the early data. And as you say, okay, but have things changed? Well, obviously things have changed in China in the last couple of decades. And so we took the leap and said, okay, we've been collecting data in China, let's replicate this. So what this first part will focus on 10 years later. We're going to compare what were the findings before and what are the findings for the later set and how have they changed. And the focus is on business managers and professionals in this study. So we're taking a multi-level perspective on values evolution. We don't have many replications, and you'll find out that you can have some surprises on this. But basically we're looking at 3 different types of hypotheses. The first around the global level, around the effects of globalization that would affect everyone. The next at a national level, which is a more traditional one that is taken in our research, is what's been happening overall in the Chinese context. And then we go to the regional level. Within the regions, and in particular China is an interesting context to study because there have been differences in terms of economic development policies decided on by regions. So we actually have cleaner comparisons than you would have in other countries. So we have these 3 different levels and different sets of hypotheses as to how will values change over a period of 10, 12 years. And the values we focus on in this study are individualism, which is about being primarily concerned with one's self-interests and maybe the nuclear family. Collectivism, which is focused more on in-group collectivism in terms of the needs and interests of the group, the collective, whether it's the family, tribe, or town or village, could take preference. So you have subordinating preference. And then we look at Confucianism, which is a combination of, it's not directly, it's related to collectivism, but it is a bit different in terms of, and we use these, our measure was enabled us to have an assessment of societal harmony, personal and interpersonal harmony, and virtuous interpersonal behavior. So a different configuration. And I'll explain why we focused on Confucianism. Of course, it's been changing here. So we take those together and we say, how will these three levels, which one is most explanatory in terms of the nature of values change? So, in terms of global level, the premise for this is really following the global modernization hypothesis that says that because of all the different things in terms of information technology, multinationals, it's one big world, so there's a movement towards having a similar workforce, similar values orientations across the world. It says it's maybe not all completely the same, but there's a movement, pressures towards more homogenization across cultures. So what this says is usually that in China, the openness, what a key part about this was the openness to trade that arose out of in 1978 with the social reforms. So this openness, there was a change there, that perhaps that's had an impact, that maybe the Western influence has been more prevalent there. Usually in this hypothesis, the trend towards change is towards the Western model, the Western values orientation. That has been critiqued, but there's not as much research exactly doing that. So theoretically you say, okay, it maybe not, but however, in this case, the modernization literature says it's going towards the westernized model, and we see that in terms of our educational materials. So for example, a lot of the critiques of Western educational models being adapted in China wholesale, and then the movement towards more indigenous education. So one thing accelerating this perhaps was the 2001 World Trade Organization membership of China, where changed a number of laws and regulations, lowering tariffs, opening up trade, opening up interaction. With this, of course, came the establishment of more joint ventures, foreign direct investment goes up. So generally with the globalization hypothesis, we predict that it will be towards westernization in terms of our values. Generally it's individualism, which is seen as more prevalent and more important in Western societies, will become more important, and collectivism and Confucianism will become less important, that it'll be less consistent with the globalization hypothesis. So that's the first set. If globalization is the prevailing force, a very important force, we should see values change towards higher individualism, lower collectivism, Confucianism. However, national level forces for change. When we talk about opening up and talk about free trade in China, we also know that it's a transitional economy, that free market capitalism is not the same in China as it is practiced in Western countries like Canada and the US. It is market socialism. There are controls. State-owned enterprises still retain a large portion of the economy. There are joint ventures with state-owned enterprises. There are different organizational forms in China that are unique adaptations that we don't see in other contexts. And part of this is being part of the transitional economy. So we say, yes, but not a totally free market economy. with some adjustments and retention of centralized control by the government. And then also the technology explosion. Yes, we do have the internet. Yes, it is easier to have information, communication technology across borders globally. However, there are still controls. So for example, we hear about, just recently, the censorship, websites. And I read about how Gmail is no longer available as of December 2014 in China. So there are controls, there's still censorship. So it's about, yes, an opening up, however, not complete. So with those particular ones, we see that maybe an increase in individualism, decrease in collectivism, which are the ones we see as most directly related to economic development influences. Maybe not so much. Maybe there's counteracting forces that maybe we will not see a significant change. Confucianism, on the other hand, this has been a philosophy that has had a resurgence. The central government, of course, is promoting. The Confucius Institutes are established. Recently, President Xi actually had a speech that featured about the importance of Confucianism in modern China. So, in contrast, there is now more reports about Neo-Confucianism, the reemergence of Confucianism and solidification. So in contrast to the other influences, see a movement about increasing the importance of that. So overall, maybe there's countervailing forces on the globalization because of the Chinese context. So might be neutralizing. No significant change in individuals and collectivism. In contrast, Confucianism compared to the early days to the 2004-5 where we surveyed, maybe there has been an increase. So there are two sets of hypotheses. Any questions? So these are traditional ones we deal with cross-cultural research, and then we go in. Regional level forces for change. What is this? At the regional level, as I mentioned earlier, there have been the opening up, social reforms has been not at the same pace in the different regions. So starting in 1984, so the National Economic and Technological Development Zones. So these, I've circled the cities in which we collected data, and so they'll be representative of the regions that we'll be looking at. So 1984 to 88, the eastern coastal regions. In our sample, they include Shanghai, Dalian, and Guangzhou. They were the first to open up, and so foreign investment, trade, export-oriented industries. Following that, in 1992-93, there was a second group that we're focused on, and in that group was Beijing, was in a economic and technological development zone. However, it was only in 2000, 2002 that the Middle West regions, including Chengdu and Lanzhou, got the same permission. So the focus was changed, so it was a staged progress in terms of opening up. And our hypothesis, our expectations are that the changes in values may be at a different rate, depending on the exposure to the new economic systems, especially in the workforce, different kinds of business ideology influences. It would have changed that. So in this regard, we also, for our study, what we've done is we've grouped them into 3 regions for comparison. And the first region would include Shanghai and Guangzhou as perhaps the earliest ones. The earliest ones, and the ones that are closest together, we relied on the NERI Marketization Index, which looks at things such as foreign investment, the structure of the local economy, how much percentage of state-owned enterprises and such, legal frameworks and such. They seem to be closer, and we're trying to talk about regional. The next region I'll identify is the Middle West one, Chengdu and Lanzhou. Those were the last to open up in terms of the free trade. So having them together, they should be more similar. And then comes Dalian and Beijing, which are kind of unique in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, they're kind of in between the other two. Even though Dalian was part of the economic trade development zone at the same time as Shanghai, for example, it's not quite the same city. It's not quite the same context when we look at the marketization index and all the other economic indicators. And Beijing is unique in a number of ways, being the capital. So for our purposes, just initially here, we've put them together because they're kind of in between the other two. So we'll compare those to the three regions, because we go into the individual ones, it gets very interesting and challenging. So the regional level forces. In this, so as I mentioned, we're looking at the trade openness. First of all, the segmentation of the regions, establishing that maybe there would be differences in values orientations there in the workforce. Also in terms of the sequencing of the trade openness, and not to forget the international migration. That's the other part, is that there has been a movement from the inland provinces to the coastal regions. And that's been the greatest influx. That changes things in terms of how the values orientations of the workforces are. So we also note that there's much more now in terms of the increasing disparities or inequalities amongst the various provinces and regions. And usually having this in the haves being the early coastal, eastern coastal cities, zones, have been benefited the most, being the beneficiaries of the openness to the greater extent, whereas the Middle West and West, not as much benefits. So in this regard, following through in terms of the economic development, the opening up, exposure to Western business ideologies would suggest that individualism should have increased over this period of time. Collectivism should have decreased. However, Confucianism should have increased. However, we're proposing that the rate of change would be different, that the region, the cities in the region that were earliest have had the longest and most extensive exposure to economic development, they will have had the most change, whereas the region, Chengdu and Lanzhou, they would have had least change over this period that we're studying, and in between, of course, is Beijing and Dalian. And so for each of those, so we're doing a variation on the previous hypotheses in terms of we will find these rates of change to vary, and what are the implications of that. Okay? So that's where we're hoping. So that's what we're proposing. So we're doing 3 different levels, 3 different sets of hypotheses, predictions. So our samples. So what we've done is the earlier 1993, 94, we had Chinese managers and professionals in the 6 cities, and they completed this, and that was the first study. Then we replicated it and collected it in 2004, 2005, and we same cities and managers and professionals. We have a reasonable sample size on both, and enough balance between the regions. We looked at, in our analyses, we control for basics like age, gender, education level, position level, and company size, so that we can kind of focus on perhaps the most relevant parts. So what did we find? This is what we found. Basically, we found that in the analyses that overall, there was no significant change in individualism, no significant change in collectivism. And for this, what we did is we did the country level of analysis. So the reality is those And then the Confucianism, significant increase. So when you take China as a whole, altogether in the analyses, that's how we test the global level hypothesis, which takes the country as the entity, as well as the national level. We actually find support for the national level hypotheses, that perhaps there has been countervailing forces that have individuals and collectivism, no significant change. Okay, this is after controlling for all those other personal characteristics. However, we do see overall a significant increase in the ascribed importance of Confucianism values. So usually we would stop there and say, yes, we saw some change, but because we're doing a regional level, we made it complicated, unfortunately, in some regards. And he says, no, it's more interesting than that. At the end, when we look at the regions, it's not all the same. And so that's where the interaction hypothesis comes in. And we had different types of values cross-vergence amongst the regional clusters. Just in 2008, David Ralston presented about cross-vergence and elaborated in terms of longitudinal values change. And there are three different kinds. Conforming, static, and deviating. And pictures are better. So conforming cross-vergence is such that, and this is actually follows the modernization hypothesis. The first one, the classic one is what was different will become very similar. Okay, and the top one is the classic convergence, which recognizes, say, the top line is the Western ideology, business ideology, value set, and China would be going towards that. However, life is kind of different. You can have similarities that are on the way, not completely joined, but in the direction towards becoming more similar. And this is more realistic in terms of, especially when sometimes values changes may take decades or centuries to accomplish. So you want to see whether there's a trend. So the bottom two lines indicate more coming together, becoming more similar, not quite the same, okay, but allows. So we're talking about conforming, they're coming together. The second one is static cross-vergence. And this is the classic divergence that would say each culture is unique, no matter what happens. These are our cultural anchors that will remain constant. And we often find that in terms of what time period do you measure change in values orientations. So the top set are classic divergence. There'll be no change whatsoever. However, you need to recognize that maybe if you're comparing two groups, they may be both going in the same direction, but still separate, still different. So this one says they might be both declining, but not coming together, still retaining a distinctiveness. Could easily be the other way, both moving up. But to say in parallel, we can have values change in parallel. So that's another elaboration on that. The third one, these are only two of the things, and this is where you talk that we can have deviating cross-vergence. The first can be non-intersecting, okay, very similar, but for whatever reason become more different. The other one is crossover. One group was higher than the other one at one point in time, and time period two, guess what, they reversed. These are all possibilities to encounter. So these are three generic ways in which values change could be theorized. We needed to use this in terms of comparing how exactly have the different regions moved, how the values orientations of the business managers and professionals changed over the 10, 11 years that we surveyed. In terms of individualism, remember it said overall, no significant difference. However, as you can see here, that for Beijing, Dalian, there has been a decline. That's a significant change down. Chengdu and Lanzhou increase. Now, where they were very different before, they are now quite similar. However, Guangzhou and Shanghai, notice they were significant, they haven't had no significant change, okay, over that period of time. They're the highest on individualism, they're still the highest. It looks like they're coming down, but statistically I can't say that it's been a significant decrease. So we're seeing a movement there, but it's different. So overall, when you put them all together in a country level of analysis, you come up with no significant difference because they're canceling each other out. Okay. So that's the case for individualism. So in terms of the nature cross-vergence, we find two conforming coming closer together, but we're actually seeing that Beijing, Dalian, and Guangzhou and Shanghai are deviating, they're becoming more different, non-intersecting. So there's movement there. Collectivism is very interesting because where they're all significantly different in the earlier data set, second data collection, guess what? There are no significant differences between the different regions. Namely, there's been the conforming. So now, in this regard, if you were to talk, a conclusion could be in China, there is a unitary appreciation for the importance of collectivism. But to get there, as you can see, Chengdu and Lanzhou, they declined. Meanwhile, Beijing, Dalian, flatline, no significant difference, and yet there was a significant increase in the eastern coastal. But now, this is all common. So on this, we actually have, consistent with the conforming, everything is becoming similar in terms, but how they arrive there is quite interesting. And then we have Confucianism, and this one is really, in terms of Chengdu and Lanzhou, there has been no significant change, but the other two regions, there has been an increase, significant increase in the importance of Confucianism values. So I said Confucianism values are more important. These are the two regions that have been driving it. So when you say there's three different ways to say between regional differences. So two of the regions are conforming, others are staying different, others are deviating. So this is showing a different appreciation for how the values changed, and they have changed differently than collectivism. There's a distinction there. So maybe just to put it all together, two main points. If you look in the middle column, conforming, all coming together on collectivism. However, what's really interesting is the two regions, the one that has the highest economic development level, opened up the earliest, is actually coming closer to the one that has been least open, that came later to becoming an economic and trade development zone. And it seems like the Beijing Dalian are the different ones for a number of reasons. Thoughts, questions?
Will you be going into the reasons for, or at least some of my thoughts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, this makes it complicated. Can you see why people don't want to do region studies? Because it was the story was so clean earlier when I'm talking at the national level. So one of the things is why would they come closer together? Part of it, yes, I'll get to that. Part of it is the main point, you should really not be doing one level analysis, especially in a country as complex in the history and development as China. And each piece gives us a different part of the puzzle. The regional level findings actually are more informative than the national level. What's interesting is the regional clusters, there's towards value similarity, but it is within the two regions that seem most disparate, that have come closer together. But all this is, it seems like it's not economic development so much as political influences that are predominant in a country like China. The values change in the direction, where we end up, where we started to where we are later. The values change, for example, in respect to the more developed regions, are more in the direction favored by government. Okay, the kind of increase in the Confucianism values in terms of the individualism, collectivism being separate, shifting down. That's the direction primarily for Guangzhou and Shanghai. That seems to be the most responsive to the political influences. Beijing Dalian's interesting because there's more disparities between the two. But in general, what's interesting is the Middle West region is actually the movement taking away from the absolute level. The movement has been in the opposite direction. So whereas there's been a promotion of Confucianism ideology, values, Chengdu and Lanzhou, they started off higher, okay? But they have decreased rather than increased. The other two have increased. They're on their way to decreasing. So it's interesting that it seems like the regions that are closest, who have been the beneficiaries earliest with government, tend to follow the same path that reflects the prevailing political position on this, or business ideology. Questions, ideas?
If you were to do the study 10 years from now,
Yes.
when both Chengdu and Lanzhou have a longer history of exposure to these values, would you expect that they would be following the path of the two other groups? So is it a really time thing where, oftentimes over time you see something moving in a certain direction and then regressing?
That's a possibility. So you're saying like time 3, most definitely. But if you look at the direction, let's look at this one in particular. It's going down on collectivism, up on individualism. If you look at the direction in which it's going, down on collectivism, I mean, it's now similar, but the movement is downwards on that. And in terms of Confucianism, no significant increase or decrease. It's not statistically significant, but the direction, it's at the marginally significant level. So the movement is, if we were to do, the follow-up prediction would be, if we were to do this like this year or next year, would we then see even more of a de-emphasis on Confucianism values for the Middle West region? And then that would be an interesting finding. Or will it self-correct and everything will level off? That's all part of it, But they are earlier, when we collected the data, are earlier in terms of opening up, so where would they have been? Yes?
Could I turn it upside down and say that actually the government is changing? If you look at the past 3 decades, the government in Beijing has been dominated by leaders from the coast. Hu Jiantao is from Jiangsu province, Jiang Zemin from Shanghai, Deng Xiaoping was from Chengdu, from Sichuan. So is it that really the attitude change in these regions that's being reflected in the government, rather than the regions conforming to the government?
Interesting. So the philosophy of the government shifts, and whichever one is the closer match would be reflected. Very good, thank you. That's a good one. It's
I
quite
think
possible.
the question then is that why the inner regions are not shifting in the same direction as the coast?
Exactly.
Is it because the coastal region has becoming more prosperous? People are becoming more complacent and do not really want to go through the revolutions that's been occurring over the last number of decades, while the inner regions who have not benefited as much from the development are looking for change so that they could participate in the benefits the coast have received.
And that would explain the increase in the importance of individualism in that region, which emphasizes that change orientation. Yeah. Quite possible. Thank you. Thank you. That's very good. I will integrate that into our interpretation. This is, by the way, not published yet. So we're all in process here. Okay, so the leadership, yes. And actually that fits with especially, well, the Confucianism, the promotion of Confucianism values, which were not as prominent before.
Confucianism is really very much a case of stability. Confucius is trying to create a society with minimal conflicts. But that is not society best suited for new breakthroughs, innovations, and step changes. So Confucius is very much a status quo.
Which is interesting since it's been given so much. I read the recent speech by the president on that. And it's also at the time when the projections have been downplayed, right? The economic growth projections. Yeah. So stability and growth. What's interesting is, though, the phenomenal growth rate that has occurred over the last 20 years. And so that creates an instability that maybe people think can make people insecure. Yeah. So maybe calming it down a bit would be consistent with that.
I think the people on the coast are getting scared now that they can see all the empty buildings, all the infrastructure that are in surplus, all the major commodity industry that are overbuilt, and they do not really see an easy solution out of that. So the increase in standard of living that they have enjoyed over the last few decades, they're not seeing a track that can maintain that improvement. Whilst the folks in the inland, they haven't reached that level yet,
Yes.
and they would still want to move forward to copy what has happened on the coast. So I think for us operating in China, it is difficult because of this conflicting changes in different regions. I call it societal living simultaneously over 2,000 years. There's still people living in caves in Yangchuan, 4.5 hours out of Beijing, and you have the best hotels in the world.
I mean, one limitation of this is we're just looking at business professionals and managers who are higher socioeconomic status, right? So for it is a segment of the population, most definitely. If we were to be able to include the full range of the society, the population, we may get a very different picture.
I think that maybe not, partly because the general public in the inland provinces are very much influenced by the feedback from the migrant workers who's gone from the coast.
Exactly. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, there's a lot of, and the movement, the nature of the movement is interesting, isn't it?
Aren't your two time period populations basically the same populations, like the same individuals?
They're not the same individuals. Impossible to
No,
keep
okay.
tracking. It's longitudinal panel data, and they're sampled from the same populations, and that's why we do the controls for all the demographic characteristics to kind of even that out.
Because I'm wondering whether or not some of the Chengdu, Lanzhou trends that you're seeing are influenced by the fact that perhaps the managers at professionals you're interviewing in Chengdu and Lanzhou actually moved from the coast or moved from Beijing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it would probably be more to the coast rather than,
I would think that in later periods, they would be moving in rather than out.
yeah.
Maybe in time period one, a predominant number of them would be moving to the coast. But I think
Exactly.
now, maybe in time period 3, there would be a lot moving back
Yeah.
because Chengdu and Lanzhou were becoming much more developed.
Yeah, tracking where the people grew up, we have inconsistent data on that, so I can't do the analyses, unfortunately. But that in itself is a totally, do you get attracted to a particular, the movement? Who would be moving? Would be the ones who are attracted to a particular way of life, way of doing business. That would be part of it. But of course, the development later in the middle, in the Western, most definitely we'll see a movement. But the early stuff, especially in the 1990s, it was definitely an out-migration.
Yes.
Yeah.
But by the 2000s, it was
It's starting
perhaps
to
coming
shift,
back.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think we would have more interchange even if I were to do these, we were to do these surveys again today.
Yes.
Most definitely. Makes it quite interesting, doesn't it? And how much mixture. And if you were to follow that through, then we would see less distinctions between the regions, wouldn't we? We would, because of that mobility, it wouldn't be in one direction. It would be interacting, and maybe we'd have no significant changes overall at the level we're talking about. Yeah.
Do you plan to do that again this next year?
Good question. Good question. Like they say, there's always opportunities and to do that. But first, we'll focus on getting this one published. But we are part of a consortium of researchers, and so yes, we've talked about it. It's quite a large endeavor to collect this data, to find willing people to be with us is another thing. But yes, I mean, that's obviously, that would be the final thing, over 30 years change. Yeah, be lovely. Yes.
Carolyn, first you had your hand.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
nice, thank you. I wondered about as well the causes of these influences as perhaps reflecting for Chengdu and Lanzhou is that they are the time lag and that they're at a different stage of development, westernization influence and
Yes.
growth economically, entrepreneurship, and so that they're earlier in the developmental curve. The other thing I wondered is whether there's any differences in the political influence, because there's probably a tension between the political influence of China versus what the westernization has occurred throughout the world. And finally, a thought occurred to me is that perhaps, I don't know if it might even be a sign, early sign of global convergence, in that now, ironically, in the Western countries, as China is becoming more westernized and developing individualism as liberty and freedom, that the West is adapting to our challenges with greater emphasis on collaboration and cooperation and of course the corporate social responsibility. So perhaps Beijing, I'm just wondering, Beijing and Shanghai, which are more advanced or more developed, that they too have influences because of their interaction with the West, especially the educated, the elite, the business and professional elite. So just some thoughts.
Yes, and your first question on the first. Yes, actually, when we look at the regions, they are proxies for representative of different levels of exposure and opening up. And when we see the individualism rising for Chengdu, Lanzhou, maybe that, if we had surveyed 10 years before for Shanghai, for example, maybe we would have, now they're high, maybe they were low, and it's where on the curve on the exposure curve. So maybe they went through their increase and now they're coming back down for whatever reason. And yes, in that way, we are seeing at different phases in terms of economic development and implementation of free trade.
I did have a quick question in terms of individualism. How does it compare in terms of absolute values between Chengdu, Lanzhou, and the Beijing and Shanghai? Are we looking at trends, or has it been measured in terms of the absolute values? Are they actually converging because it's a catch-up phenomenon?
So on this, okay, first of all, we need to do a conversion in terms of standardizing these scores, because that's an indicator of how different the cultures are. So it's all relative, but across these three values, in each of the time periods for each of the regions, Confucianism is the most important of the three. Where we're seeing the movement is on individualism and collectivism. So we're seeing a shift, for example, Chengdu, Lanzhou, whereas in 1993-94, collectivism was second ranked and higher than individualism. However, at the later time period, individualism is actually similar to collectivism, but now it's higher than. It comes first, so it may be even, it's not significantly different, but it's been a change in order for that. Whereas the relative ranking for Guangzhou and Shanghai has stayed the same: Confucianism, individualism, then collectivism, the relative rankings there. And then for Beijing, Dalian, it's Confucianism first, and the order of individualism and collectivism are not significantly different, but the order has changed. Whereas in the early time period, individualism was a little bit higher, now it's a little bit lower than collectivism. So there's been a reversal there.
I guess I was wondering about the absolute values and individualism between the three areas. Has that been compared? Maybe you did answer, I just didn't get it.
Okay, so absolute values. Okay, so on this one, it depends on which time period you're looking at. So on this one, on the Confucianism, where, for example, Beijing Dalian is now significantly higher than Guangzhou, Shanghai. Okay, that's significantly higher, whereas before they were significantly lower. Okay, on that one. Let's see here. Oh, wait a sec. There. On this one, the order and the left are all significantly different between, in terms of the time period one, but time period two, all the same.
One would think it's logical to see a similarity between Confucianism and collectivism.
Yeah, but they're slightly different. They're connected in a certain way, but the way we measure it is a bit different in terms of there are different items that are included for our measure of Confucianism, but they are related. And that's what makes it so interesting, because we said, okay, they're closely related, it should be the same, but it's not. Yeah, it's different. Yeah, there's some overlap. So for this in the regions, you say how are they rating against each other? Well, it depends on which time period you're looking at. Yeah, it really does. Yeah, that's good. And the global convergence, yes, the global convergence towards the interaction across cultures. Will it come together? Is it the concept about Western modernization highly individualistic? Is that the wave of the future? Well, there's a lot of critiques around, and you're right. Relaxing that and becoming more communitarian. Collectivism may become the more global norm. Yes, most definitely. Great question. Yes?
Just a quick, I have a feeling I'm opening a can of worms. I'll just make a quick observation and we'll discuss it, okay?
You don't want to discuss?
On the Confucianism,
Yes.
for the Chengdu, Gansu, region.
Yes.
A big part, I think, an important part of what you call it Confucianism here, is uncertainty avoidance, which is one of the categories that Hofstede used. He used individualism, collectivism, I think, and he introduced in, I believe, in Beyond Cultures or Culture's Consequences. He
A while ago.
Confucianism, right? Yeah, but if you look at it from the perspective of uncertainty avoidance, then a slight decline in the hinterlands in uncertainty avoidance would mean a slight increase in sort of entrepreneurial daring, that sort of thing. So that, to me, that becomes quite understandable, because we are seeing the growth in enterprise.
Right.
Yeah, in that region.
And that takes us to, it's really about values orientation and priorities. There really is no absolute, it's all relative. Which one do you value more than another? We put numbers to them to study them. And Hofstede would have individualism, collectivism, and have it on continuum. However, in our research, we put them separate, because you can be individualist, you can have similar scores depending on which aspect of your life you're looking at as well. So we're finding that even though they're closely negatively related, it's not necessarily so. You can see persons who go high on both and low on both, because that's just two of so many values one can take into consideration. Yeah, but you're right. Usually you would say, okay, we'll just relax the stability part, and that will obviously that will indicate that we want more, we can value more on the individualism side, most definitely. Yeah, and so yes, we're dealing with relative importance always with this.
What you're calling relative importance, I would call balance. What I see is in any healthy organization or healthy society, or for that matter, in a healthy individual, you may start with a premium on, let's say, on individualism, but in order to avoid chaos, you have to impose a certain amount of, you call it collectivism, but to group focus, because if individuals do not cooperate, the result is chaos. If you start with a conservative focus on the importance of cooperation, you have to inject a certain amount of individualism or individuality, or that collectivist preference will stagnate. So it comes to balance. I like it as a Venn diagram, where you have collectivism over here, individualism here, and you have the overlap, which is where a healthy organization is going to go from here to the middle, and or from here to the middle.
Quite possibly, yeah.
I didn't want to open a can of worms.
No, that's okay, but it does. I'm glad you did, because it does raise the point. It's about balancing and trade-offs, and one says that I am, and sometimes it's not a direct trade-off. By the way, it can be together. But can we value all things all times, all at a high level? That's very difficult to say, because some of these values are contradictory. They're opposing by their nature. And so usually you say, I will subscribe more to the importance of one particular value. It will often mean relaxing or letting go of another type of value that otherwise we have internal tensions, but sometimes it can be intolerable. And can values change as you learn through life? Yeah. Yes.
I think you really need to do another study, because this is so important in terms of us looking at the global level on where the future of China is going. In businesses, we're now faced with the issue that China is no longer a cheap labor location. Mexico is within NAFTA. Labor rate is much cheaper in Mexico now, much more competitive, much closer to the market. But China is becoming such a big factor in our whole global economy. And if China cannot land softly in this present conversion from export-driven economy towards a consumer-oriented economy, or domestic consumer-oriented economy, the whole world will be in trouble because it will introduce political instability, there will be economic stagnation, and for Canada, our commodities will not be, there's no market for our commodities unless India comes up quickly. So I think your study, was it financed by the one of the three councils?
No, with our consortium, UFERC, University Fellows International Research Consortium, we are a network organization of scholars across. I'm just focusing in depth on China today, but we have collected data in over 50 countries, and we do those comparisons on the values as well as upward influence, ethical influence tactics and such. So in other papers we have these comparisons. So we one paper that just appeared was we looked at the BRIC countries, and we looked at corporate responsibility attitudes of managers and professionals compared to business students, future leaders. So yes, this is not alone. We compared China. We have another paper that was published. We compared the change with a different data set: China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. How is that shifted? And we also documented the nature of change there. Values.
But who is funding these studies?
We are self-funded, basically. Yeah. What happens? Our arrangements is it's a trust network. We have professors in different universities, and they do the translations, back translations, pilot tests that are needed, and we provide the central. There's a common survey questionnaire, and they fund and so then we have a central. It's their data. They fund it, but they provide it to the consortium. So then we deal with, we develop papers that do cross-country, cross-cultural studies, and any paper that their data is used on, they're co-authors. They have earned it.
You should really approach McKinsey. Because I think that would be something that they would be very interested in from a global consulting perspective on where China is headed.
Well, yes, and we've read the McKinsey stuff. We have different kind of business models, if you would say. We definitely stay independent, and it's purely academic research, purely academic. So we've had people in our consortium for a long number of years, trusted colleagues throughout. And on this, for the China data, we have for this first paper, we have 2 colleagues in China who have been involved with the data collection. Actually 3, one for the earlier one and then 2 later. And then and another person who is from another country who has helped to write it. So we're very much into collaborative research models here. Yes. So you're only seeing a small slice of our whole research program here, but to go in depth is really important. A number of our studies have taken, at the country level, comparison, but China presents a particularly important and interesting context in which to actually look within regions, within a country, because of the history, that we have these demarcations, so theoretically we can explore whether this has made a difference. We have a unique model for doing research, and it's been working.
I'm just thinking that the research has more application than just research.
Yes. Well, that's the other part. That's the other part. So this is only one part, but what's interesting is there's very little longitudinal research done. For a number of reasons. Having a research team that's been in existence who collect this using the same survey instruments, the same sampling protocols and such, so you can have comparable samples. But the reality is is that we do need it. Because if we're just doing cross-sectional, we have limitations in terms of this is only one snapshot in time. We have one picture for the paper that was published in 1996. We now have a different picture that includes data in 2005. And then, like you say, you want a third iteration, and we will discuss that. Yeah.
Well, I think this is important because the China model is being discussed as whether actually this is not a more effective model for development than the conventional Western model, which has proven to be completely ineffective, especially look at what happening in Africa. So there are a lot of discussion about copying, transferring the Chinese development model into Africa. But right now we're looking at a potential crisis on can China achieve the second French Revolution that Europe did without the second revolution? China has gone through the first revolution, like first French Revolution, and gone through Mao Zedong as the Napoleon and so forth. It's moving towards the second French Revolution. But that's a very chaotic revolution in Europe. But it did achieve the purpose of liberalizing the whole continent, or most of the continent, to what we are seeing today in terms of the social values developed in Western Europe. Can China move in that direction? Or is it really going to go into a completely different direction? And so this is really where your research cannot be done quickly, and you've done 20 years. So I think it's so important to capture 30 years.
Point well taken, thank you. We're still, I find this fascinating, studying this and just saying which way will it go. It's so much. But you actually have made a good transition to our second paper that we are working on, and this is very new. Because we talk about values. The other one was at one type of subcultures, okay? This one looks at generation cohorts. And I almost, but I didn't. I wanted to, there's always been this thing about generational clashes, right? There's a song, what is it? Kids aren't what they used to be. Like, yeah, what's the matter with kids today? The Bye Bye Birdie one. This second one is that values don't appear out of thin air, and values orientations may be defined by the context in which we grew up in. So for this, we go more to the psychological aspect, to the origins in terms of the period in which we are born and raised. Our childhood and early adulthood establishes our view of the world, our values orientation. That then is the basis which we carry with us throughout our lives. It may shift, but it's like the baseline is set. So Strauss and Howe have generational theory that has become very popular. It's the foundation for, they're the ones who identified a number of generations, baby boomers, Gen X, and now millennials. And now homelands, they actually have a homeland generation. But they really did popularize the generation cohort idea in the US. Now the key thing is every context, how you would define a generation identity would be derived from the particular socio-political and cultural events that happened during that early formative period when you're growing up and learning about the world and forming your worldview. So the theory is that you would have, there would be differences depending on when you grew up. In addition to where you grew up is when you grew up within a country, and that you could actually compare these. And for Strauss and Howe, what they did is there are 4 types of generation that are approximately about 20 years in duration, birth years. And there are turnings throughout history, and they track it back way back into the 16th or 1400s in terms of these historical turnings of generations to define, and they would have commonalities. And one of so this was the foundation. There's been a lot written lately about millennials. It's been kind of a boom industry, not only in North America, but also in China. There's a lot of popular press literature on Chinese millennials, okay, the new generation. And so one of the things we do is that a lot of the US-based research talking about millennials and their characteristics, and I'll explain that, has actually been, all generation cohort, been actually kind of adopted, transferred across cultures. So you have studies which refer to millennials in whatever country you could name, as well as they're using the same demarcations for baby boomers and Gen Xers. But the theory says that not every country participated, for example, in World War II, right? If you didn't go through that historical event with the aftermath, really that shouldn't be part of the generational identity in a country or culture which didn't participate in that world event. And similarly with the millennials, is it really the same? Should they have similar characteristics? So part of this study is to really examine that, you know, how much is cross-culturally generalizable about certain stereotypes. And for this, just to, has everyone heard about, are you familiar with the millennial?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just to say core traits of millennials. You know, just like everything else, there's some positives and there's some negatives with any stereotype. But these are the core traits of the millennials for the US, taken from Strauss and Howe's work. And basically, you know, cooperative, optimistic, trusting, they follow rules, civic-minded, they're achieving, and then we get to some negative ones, feeling special, being sheltered, maybe overly confident, pressured, and conventional, not too innovative. But you see on the other side, there's some, and I've taken these from the more what's being put out on the magazines and such, the Chinese millennials. The stereotype associated with Chinese millennials who are born around the same time, cosmopolitan and educated. This is part of the opening up, okay? Internet generation. Also more individualistic than predecessors. Confucian traditional values. Okay, that's based on what I just presented, maybe that would be so. However, there is a downside to the stereotype, the materialism, and the pampered little emperors and empresses, you see a lot written about that. So it has some positive aspects and some negative aspects. But the question for us is, how true is this? On what basis are we making these generalizations about a lot of people? Okay. So and this is one area in which identifying traits or values orientations has actually spawned, at least in Western societies, also transferring a whole industry around HRM strategies for the millennial generation. So these are just a few of the ones, and some of these are kind of interesting. So treat them like VIPs is about implementing mentoring programs in your company. Find them early, give them internships and safe career days. Look after them, give them safety training, but an unusual one is help them fill out their benefit forms. Look after them. So offer structure and teach them the basics. Basically that translates in define their job responsibilities. Provide tight cycles of feedback. Give them performance reviews on a regular basis. Don't offer a McJob. They define McJobs as meaningless, repetitive, and boring work. This isn't anything new. We know that people are demotivated, so for about 40 years now, we've had job enrichment strategies to teach in our HRM classes and leadership classes. Make them part of a group. Offer team and group-based rewards. Be active in the community, do CSR, and take an interest in their success. Give them training and development. A lot of this is just best HRM practices. This is nothing new, really nothing new. With the possible exception of, there's one more, co-recruit the parents. This one is new, and so one of the advices is to provide newsletters to your parents, social media, and have open houses for parents. We're talking about employees' parents, and that is unique. But that goes towards the stereotype that said about being sheltered and all the rest of it. So these are things, and there's a lot being done in terms of promoting how to transform your HR systems to deal with the millennial employees. But in actual fact, a lot of this is just basic best practices for HRM. So why is it that this has taken such hold? That's one of our questions. Well, to go back, on what basis do we have this archetype or stereotype about a whole generation of our new employees in the workforce? Well, the original research was actually done by Strauss and Howe, and it was done in 2000. So they defined the millennials based on a sample. They interviewed high school students. They surveyed high school students. And they surveyed high school students in a suburb of Virginia that is just outside of Washington, D.C. And so this has been one thing that has been critiqued, is that this is from quite a well-to-do suburb. And that twice the national average in terms of median income, as well as predominantly white. There are very few racial minorities in this community. So the stereotype, this is the foundation for the millennial archetype. It's quite a small select sample, but this archetype based on that sample has been quite persistent. When I say that there's questions about survey administrative procedures, it's reported that some of the parents were present while the students were being interviewed. Okay. But if you look at the analysis, it's mainly descriptive statistics, and a lot of critiques about relying on these anecdotes, quite selective. Academic research, journals would not accept these. And there's been variability in the start and end dates. So there have been serious questions brought in the academic literature about on what basis are we making these generalizations about a whole generation of people. And so it's been quite resilient. So just fairly recently, people have started saying, okay, how real is this stereotype? So I'll just present a couple of these, is that they're saying if this is a US stereotype which has been very influential cross-culturally, they're starting to look at doing real research, longitudinal research that actually identifies and controls out life stage differences. This is a critical thing. You can't do this in cross-sectional. But what's the difference between a cohort versus this is just a natural outlook depending on your life stage, right? When you're young, you view the world in one way. When you're older, you view the world in a different way, okay? And are there period effects? And for now, we actually have large samples, controlled samples, and then we control for things like age, the year of birth, gender, education level, which is critical, okay? There are subcultures depending on educational level and socioeconomic status. We know this. And so this large-scale research, just to, this is the title which kind of gives it away. This is an incredible, it's an employee opinion survey, and they tracked it for 18 years, and that sample size is very large, 115,000. So this would be the company surveys, employee attitude surveys they do. They were able to control for age and time period effect. You can't control for age in a cross-sectional study because it's overlapping. Use age to define cohort. So compared to boomers and Gen Xers, millennials, they actually have higher company and job satisfaction. They have more satisfaction in job security, recognition, career development, and advancement. So the question is, why are we doing special programs for them? They notice no significant differences in their satisfaction with their pay and benefits and the work itself, the turnover intentions, and this is the conclusion. Whether these special programs for millennials is debatable, they question that. That was their bottom line. This is another meta-analysis Whoa, yes.
This seems sort of counterintuitive.
Oh, yeah.
Where, on the one hand, you say that we should have the best practices for millennials means we do all these supposedly extra take care things, and then lo and behold, we find out the millennials are satisfied. Doesn't that mean that we shouldn't get rid of them? Doesn't that mean that we'd be very good at doing what we're proposing?
Well, this is actually, it's been fairly recently that these programs are promoting. What I'm saying on that is a lot of what's being promoted as special programs for millennials is actually best HRM practices, and they should not be limited to one particular group of employees.
Right.
We should be having it for everybody. The problem is it's being sold for one group, and then the other groups could be ignored. So the reality is this really so special? Except for a couple, like the Parent Day thing. Yeah, that one's kind of different. But one of the things is you need to do so much to attract and retain your millennial employees because these are their traits or characteristics. But what this research says, hey, are they any different than any other employee? They're not. The next one is a meta-analysis. Just look, they looked at cross-generational, and this is they take all the different studies and they look at effect sizes, whatever works. The bottom line is the same. Meaningful differences among generations probably do not exist on work-related variables. We examine, and differences that appear to exist are likely attributable to factors other than generational membership. Okay? So this calls into question the whole thing about special programs, and there is a lot at stake here in terms of investments. So that's only two, but the large-scale studies, longitudinal studies that are able to control, have actually shown that the role of academic research is maybe critiquing what has become, some could say, a popular myth, okay, in terms of changing workplace practices based on a thing. So in terms of generation cohorts in China, actual fact, 11 years ago, 2004, we actually did and tried to define it. On this case, it was cross-sectional. Okay, we didn't have longitudinal data, and so we defined that yes, perhaps there are different generations in China because of these radical shifts, such as the Cultural Revolution, for example, which demarcates. And we identified 4 generations there, and I did the analyses in terms of the majority of their years growing up during a particular historical period, doing cusp analysis, we're doing cutoffs. Is this cutoff appropriate or not? Is there any difference? So doing that. So that, in that paper, I'll present the results. One limitation is cross-section. Okay, so I couldn't control for age in the statistical analyses. It's been followed by other studies, Martinson and Ma, and Hung, and there's some variation in those cutoffs. So basically following the theory, we see some significant events in China's history. One is the start of the consolidation, Republican era, then the consolidation era, of course the Cultural Revolution, and then the opening up of social reform. Now obviously we're dealing with the early data, so there weren't very many social reform people in the workforce at that time. So we're just talking the early social reform people. But all these are cross-sectional, looking at different stuff. So that was early days, and so we got the foundation on the same thing with longitudinal. And we're focusing on the values orientations, and this is the Schwartz values model that we deal with. And you can see it's a circumplex model, and there are 4 different values dimensions. And the theory is if you're high on, first, self-transcendence, which is about universalism, being concerned about external forces, welfare of others, environment, social justice, and benevolence, helping others, taking care of others, that perhaps if that's particularly high, you would be also low on power, achievement, and hedonism. Hedonism very much about self-satisfaction, pleasure principle, achievement, success, more individual success accomplishments. And then power is about personal power, usually power over others, okay, so individual. And on the other dimension, being very open to change would be high on stimulation, finding exciting things, self-direction, okay, looking at freedom-oriented. In contrast, the other set of values would be conservation. So conservative, conformity, tradition, and security. Okay. So it shows the balancing act in terms of being high and low. And the circumplex model just says these tensions in us. So we use this, it's a well-validated, it's been used a long time, values model. And so we've used this instrument. And by the way, in this study, we compared US generations to Chinese generations. We used, at this point, we were still early days, so we just used the cutoffs established by Strauss and Howe. It's important to note that for the US generations, all of the relationships in terms of their personal values orientations could be explained by age. They were consistent with age-related differences. With the Chinese generations, though, we found one exception. I'll show it to you. So, with this one, openness to change. Usually, younger people are more open to change. They're just starting off life. I mean, they haven't gotten set in their ways. This is a generalization. And so, in this one, the social reform generation found its highest. Then comes the Cultural Revolution and consolidation. The Republican is there. I'm just focusing on those three because later research, there are no Republicans left in the workforce. They've all retired. So just focusing on these three. Self-enhancement. This was the one that was a cohort effect. The Cultural Revolution generation, this early research, was opposite. They should be, self-enhancement should be the youngest, has the highest. In this case, social reform were lower than the Cultural Revolution. The main driver for this was personal power, okay? So this one suggests we have a cohort effect here because it's not the usual life stage relationship. The other relationships usually have not too much generational differences between the social reform and the Cultural Revolution. Social reform read current Chinese millennials, okay? That's another term for them. But consolidation, the older ones, they were higher on those two, which is consistent with, but we're not seeing that demarcation between those two more recent generations. So that was cross-sectional data. And so we said, okay, what happens if we do the update and we do it like the more recent rigorous academic research that actually can control for age? So, over the years, we've been periodically collecting using the Schwartz Value Survey data. That's been the mainstay throughout. And so we have that early data, and we have collected data from students, business school students. Okay, so that's important for the younger ones. So periodically, so there was that early stuff that I mentioned in the previous study, plus some others, including students, and then in intervals all the way along, we've collected data from Chinese respondents. So what I've done, so I think there are about 5 or 6 different data collections. So what I did is put them all together. I can't do a regional analysis, but I can do a cohort analysis. So overall, and as I mentioned before, Republicans are starting about the late 1990s, Republicans were retiring because of the retirement age is 60 in certain places, and for women 55. So just focusing on the consolidation as the oldest generation. Then we have the Cultural Revolution and the social reform. These analyses I can control for age, gender, and education level. Okay, remember it's students, young ones as well as older. And here I find, yes, the younger and the men overall are more open to change and more self-enhancing, and the older and the women are more conservative and more self-transcendent. Okay, these are actually general trends that we find throughout. So as we get older, we become more embedded with traditions, for example, because we've been part of creating the traditions. More security needs and such. So young, definitely starting off life, having to develop oneself, having to look after oneself. As we get older, more conservative, but also more self-transcendent, and this relates to leaving one's legacy. Those become relatively more important. In the generation cohort, remember, the baseline from where you start, though, will determine the degree of change. So if you were to grow up during a particular period, your baseline might be different than a person growing up in a different period. And as we get older, we go on these trajectories, the life stage effects type, but there is this differential in where we started, okay? This is where you can define whether it's a cohort effect or an age effect. Okay, so we're in the natural life course. Education, higher education, more self-enhancing, looking after oneself, but lower conservative self-transcendent, which is an interesting one for China. So this is what happens when you control for age, and all those other age especially. Compared to the earlier one, guess what? There's no different significant cohort. I did all the cusp analysis, by the way, to see whether the cutoffs were still relevant, and yes, they are. Contrary to popular opinion, controlling for age, which means that at this stage in life, okay, consolidation era people are actually more open to change than the other two, okay? And when you think about that, and why would the social reform be more conservative than the other two, which actually goes to the rapid change, because there is the hypothesis, a scarcity hypothesis that Engelhardt does in the World Values Survey, is we desire what we were deprived of during our youth. This could be one explanation. Whereas previously, we found an age, basically it was an age related, and we acknowledge this as an implication. Once we control for the actual age of a person, life stage, we find that the current generation, the young ones, the millennials, are actually more conservative, and they are less open to change. So, but there's no significant difference on self-enhancement or self-transcendence. So this would suggest to us that on those two dimensions, there really isn't much difference until I look down into the individual values. So if you remember with this, each one of these dimensions are comprised of different facets, okay? So when I look deeper, I find here why, for example, self-enhancement is no significant difference. On each one of those components, each of the generations is the highest. There's a different cohort that's highest. So the consolidation are highest on achievement, the social reform are highest on hedonism, and the cultural revolution highest on power. That is consistent even with all the additional data we have. So that one is a very strong cohort effect. And it just goes from there. So actual fact, that's why overall for that dimension, so self-enhancement is comprised of those top three. That's why we have no significant difference, but actually we do when we go more fine-grained. In terms of stimulation and self-direction, that's the openness to change. The stimulation is actually highest for the consolidation, controlling for age. And the other two are very similar. In the current workforce in China, consolidation era cohorts are fast retiring. Okay, there aren't as many in our latest data collections. And so next time we collect data, they will not be there. So that's because of early retirement. So what we're finding is, for the majority in the workforce, is there a big difference between cultural revolution and social reform? And I looked at segments and I couldn't find a statistical difference for segmenting social reform into early versus late. When you look at this in terms of individualistic values, there are some differences, most definitely. In terms of the openness to change, there are no differences, right? They're very close. Those are the bottom two. So, but on the top ones, yes, there are some generation gaps. In terms of the Confucianism values, using Schwartz, there's a different configuration, and he identified early that conformity, tradition, and benevolence were the ones that were closest to Confucian value set. And basically, conformity, social reform are the highest. The other two are lower. This is contrary to the life stage effect. But on tradition and benevolence, no statistically significant differences. This means that there are no generation gaps that we found for these individuals in the workforce. Okay. So, and for the final two in values, universalism. This is where the stereotype actually follows through. Universal in values is really around more relating to cosmopolitanism. It's associated with social and environmental responsibility, environmental concern. On this one, we find that social reform are higher on universalism, which bodes well in terms of corporate social responsibility motivation in the workforce. In terms of security, here we go. Social reform want more security. Maybe it's been too rapid of a change, too much chaos. Now we want it more. Okay, so these are the generational differences that we found when we go more fine-grained. Are you surprised?
When was the last set of data collected?
2011. Yeah.
I think that if I'm the Chinese leadership, this is very worrisome.
Why? Why would it be?
That means China will be trapped in the, we'll see the middle income trap. Because the new generation are satisfied with what they have. They're not looking for more changes. And I think to some degree maybe explains why the consolidation generation is more open to change, because they live in an age where things were not good.
That's right.
And they need to have the changes to see improvement.
Mm-hmm. I would be more optimistic about the social reform for the universalism.
Yes.
I really would, because that is in terms of helping others, addressing the inequalities. That is part of that. That's around environmental concern, which is a very big issue. So that universalism has actually been directly associated with higher environmental concern, social justice. So that part about...
Maybe that's not so much the generation issue value, but more the fact that these values have become more prevalent because of communication. And because of also the Western society, we have seen degradation caused by economic change. And so I would argue that it is really just being exposed to the value in other societies that the new generation start to share those values.
Yes, and the reality is a large number of our social reform were surveyed in, look at the ages in which they were born. They were,
71
so they were, 71 plus. So we were starting to survey them in the early 1990s, before CSR was popular, before environmental concern was highlighted. So this is social reform from even when the early surveys, 1993 and such. We're talking about how many years? 20 years. So yes, we're talking today, which would apply to 2011, but we're also including people who were actually surveyed back in 1993, before these were popular. issues.
It started to be because my generation of engineers, we were not taught about clean technology. We taught about efficiency of production, pollution, then we'll clean it up. So that's the approach in the 70s.
Yes.
But by the 90s, we're designing clean technology processes already.
And what this is saying that over the last 20 years, we have a generation who their baseline actually puts a higher level of importance on just those values that are associated with the responsible corporate model. And so that this, and it's different than the people who were previous to them. Yeah, yeah, so this is the good thing about, so we're not dealing with, we have different people experiencing different kinds of life events, political events, and the baseline is higher for them starting. So as they, and some of them are older, okay, at this point in time. So as they get older, it's, and as they replace the Cultural Revolution managers today, we should see a shift towards that. Yeah.
I'm a businessman. I'm here not because of academic
No,
interest.
no.
But I think what you've shown us, though, is really that you're telling us how to look into the future.
Yes.
I think as we move, in the market in China, these are the value that's important as a market.
These are our anchors in terms of how do we, our values, they do change over time, but our core values, our core set, they are our guidelines in what's right and appropriate to do. And we can change to a certain extent, but the reality is that when we don't enact our values, when we're forced to do something that is contrary to what we believe in, the internal tensions, the stressors, it's not, there's a motivation to not have that stress.
Because your previous presentation is also very predictive. Because when we look back at the time when you said that that the collectivism started to go up, and Confucianism was going up, this 10 years ago. That's exactly what happened to China. In the year 2000, the Chinese private sector economy was up, state-controlled economy was down to the 30s. Over the last 10 years, under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, it's now gone back up to 50.
Yeah.
So the fact that it went down, so 100% down to the 30s, and then because of the attitude that you've shown 10 years ago, it went back down now up to 50. So the question is that if you do a survey again, it may tell us which direction.
Well,
they're gonna go.
2014, yeah, for the regions. By the way, okay, so these values, it's not, in terms of tradition, that's usually associated with, we're not seeing a generational difference.
I think you say the conformity is high for social reform. This is the current generation. They're happy with their lives and they don't want to change.
Well, some of this generation are in their 30s now. They're in their 30s, and then there's a new entrant, but we're not seeing, the significant event was the opening up, the introduction of market capitalism, the Chinese way, yeah. So this kind of run counter, it confirms certain parts of it, so there's cosmopolitanism, universalism, but it does challenge us in terms of some of the individualistic stereotype of the current social reform. In actual fact, we're not finding there is a trend that way that's consistent, that each one, they're more conservative and more universalistic. So that, and what's interesting for me is that's actually consistent more with the US millennial stereotype that's based on questionable research, and where we're not finding any, for longitudinal, we're not finding these big differences. We are finding in China, but they are definitely not more individualistic as a whole. There is variation and there's some, so we cannot do a global recognition. But the key thing is we really do need to have longitudinal research. I mean, you publish one thing on cross-sectional, it's very difficult to do longitudinal panel research, and we have to do that. You had a question? Thoughts?
I'd like to thank Carolyn for sharing all your wonderful research with us today and speaking on behalf of both David and yourself, okay, as a small token of appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and questions, because as I say, this is really new. We're just submitting these to conferences, and the ability to present to you, you're asking questions, and it really helps us develop our research. And yes, to keep, like you say, collect more data. However, at some point we have to submit.
We have your research agenda mapped out for the next 10 years.
I'm sure. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. I'd also like to draw your attention to another program that is sponsored by the David Lamb Center. This is the talk by Education Secretary from the Hong Kong Ministry of Education, Yeah. So he'll be speaking at the Burnaby campus of Simon Fraser University on March the 27th. So for those of you that are interested in exploring opportunities in Hong Kong, please get the flyer from Edith. Thank you.